we're going to be talking about the history and theory behind organizational communication and really the road to its origination. So theories, when we talk about history and theory, can be anything from simple ideas to formal systems of hypothesis. The aim of every theory is the same. It is to explain, predict, and control. So when we say something's a simple theory, think of times you may say, well, I have a theory. So it's not a formal hypothesis that is yet tested, but it's a simple idea. And sometimes going through trials and testing, you come up with a hypothesis that has that aim so that we can feel like we have predictability and control in our lives and are able to explain those things around us. Now, every theory has two features. It is both historical and is metaphorical. Historical part of theories mean that they exist in the time in which they are made. So while it is the context of the world around them that is creating it, they are also metaphorical and they help us understand later through comparison what might be happening now. This is going to be important at the end of this lecture when we start to theorize about where we are going with organizational communication, having studied where we've already been. There are 3 P's of theories. They are partial, partisan, and problematic. So any individual theory that you're studying is not complete in nature. They are also partisan. They hold the viewpoint of the person that is creating the theory. Now, this is not a political word. We use the word partisan in politics now often, but it is a word that helps us understand that it is one vantage point. And when we say theories are problematic, we're referring to the fact that often the asking of one question leads to many others that were previously unasked. So you can think of this kind of like an onion. You peel a layer away, and now you have that piece that you're working on, but there's another layer underneath. So asking questions can lead to more questions, and this is part of the process of developing theories about why things are happening. Now, this is the history component, and we're going to talk about things today, such as Eli Whitney, that you may have to reach back to. I don't know if it was 4th, 5th, 6th grade history the last time you talked about Eli Whitney, but this is really important in developing the backbone of what has become organizational communication and why this science that you are choosing to study is so important in strategic communication and problem solving today. So, in the early 18th to 20th centuries, organizations were run like empires. This was because corporations were viewed, or actually were, extensions of the government with specific goals. What were these goals? They were simple. They were to expand trade, to take trade from one place to another. Corporations were the vehicle that did that. To give employment to the masses. There are people that need to work. We're going to talk more about wages in a little while, but trade was a part of that employment and people getting the things they needed to live, to create economic and social development, which is really interesting when we look at how this was the tool that caused the mapping of cities around work and transportation lines. So when you hear that there are flooding in major areas such as Miami, New Orleans, and even up in New England, we talk about port cities. We look at the Great Lakes and the ability to get things from one place to another. And when we look at large cities in the United States, they're often surrounding either waterways, port areas, and eventually where transportation, road, and infrastructure systems were able to go, first with railroads and then with other modes of transportation. Now, in the late 1700s, now we're going to the way back, there was a birth of division of labor. And we're going to talk about 3 players in this birth. 1 in the United States, 2 out of the United States. So first we have Benjamin Franklin. I have the dates here for you. I don't know that it's necessary to memorize all of the dates in this presentation, but knowing time frames of history is important so we know the sequence of things. So Benjamin Franklin popularizes the notion of hard work in a publication called Poor Richard's Almanac. Now, Poor Richard's Almanac was really just a collection of stories and sayings. If you were to Google the 50 top sayings from Benjamin Franklin, you would get many lists of things he said. Much of this idea that conceptualized hard work has become part of what we now today still refer to. And I've given you a couple examples here. Early to bed, early to rise, make a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. There are no gains without pains, which sounds a lot like no pain, no gain. And God helps them that help themselves. So these ideas of what it means to work hard and get something for your work was popularized by Benjamin Franklin during this time. At the same time, Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, organized his army around 7 core mechanics. The first was rank, that people knew exactly what they were and what their position was inside the army based on a specific rank. Uniform, meaning both that people dressed a certain way based on rank, and everybody inside that rank did the same thing, which led to both regulations and task specialization. And this all became a part of creating standardized equipment, command language, and drill instruction. Now, if I hadn't told you that these were the 7 core mechanics of Frederick the Great's army in the 1700s in Prussia, you may have said these are the list of 7 principles of the U.S. military. This did become the standard for armies worldwide to use these core mechanics to organize their labor and divide tasks into specific areas. Finally, Adam Smith, a Scottish philosopher, publishes Wealth of Nations in 1776, which praises the division of labor in factory production and was, in fact, through that division of labor, creating a class system and enforcing a class system that many countries already had in place. Now, 1801, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. This is why it's important to understand the development of that division of labor right as the invention of the cotton gin occurs. What does this do? It gives organizations the ability to mass produce, and it extends the power of corporations and government among the individual person. It is the catalyst for the Industrial Revolution, and it begins the process of people working in exchange for a wage rather for trade, housing, things that they need to live. And the period in the late 1800s to early 1900s was really, I don't like this word anymore because we've been using it so much during the pandemic, but unprecedented economic expansion in the United States. Now, of course, it is absolutely necessary to pause and acknowledge that this period of economic expansion of the late 1800s and early 1900s was limited to people who were allowed to accumulate wealth, which largely during that time in the United States was limited to white men. It wasn't until the 50s, 60s, and even 70s in many states that even white women were allowed to, if they did work, have the check come to them in their name if they were not the head of household. So that's a conversation that we have in a deeper level in gender issues. But I wanted to pause as we're at this point in history to say, like we find in the metaphorical lessons of theories as they are developed historically, that in any area where there is a boom in economic prosperity, there may be also incredible poverty amongst another population. So from this foundation of a division of labor and economic and industrial revolution grew the classical theories of management and leadership that still exist today. And we're going to talk about each of these. They're Taylor's scientific management, Henry Fayol's functions of management, and bureaucracy. So scientific management was the work of Frederick Taylor. In the 1800s and 1900s, he was did all of his research and work to promote economic efficiency in order to analyze, optimize, and standardize workflow. He used the scientific method to try to determine the best achievements of outcomes. Even when you look at your syllabi, if you read your syllabi, there are outcomes, and the things you do in the class should be aligned with the best achievement of those outcomes. Inside of scientific management, there was still, much like the division of labor, a clear division of tasks and responsibilities. But Frederick Taylor also advocated for high pay for high performance. So if you think of this on a class level working line, if you got paid more for producing more, that changes the dynamics of the work environment, which sounds great. However, in this system of scientific management, there is both a clear hierarchy of authority and a strict supervision of employees. In fact, Frederick Taylor's work was the foundation for the modern day time clock. So if you've ever had a job where you punch in and you punch out, and I remember having jobs where the rule was it was rounded. So if you were 7 minutes after, it was rounded back. But if you were 8 minutes after when you punched in, you were actually 15 minutes late. This idea of managing time so closely, this really became Frederick Taylor's legacy, that by the end of his life, he was known as the enemy of the working man for being so controlling over every minute in time. And certainly in the first year of the pandemic, this was something with people remote working and working from home. There was this question of managing. How do we know if people are working if we can't physically see them? It became an issue of performance. What are you getting done? We have this discussion at the university of face-to-face versus mixed mode versus web courses, of the amount of work you feel like you should put in if your boss or your teacher cannot see what you're doing. The reality is, it's actually easier to see what a student is actually doing inside of a web class because there's different analytics. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Next, we have, after Taylor's scientific management, Henry Fayol's 5 functions of management. Henry Fayol was a French industrialist who also looked at a division of labor, but through a slightly different lens. He talked about that there should be these 5 functions inside of management who is overseeing a team, and they are planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. So planning is strategic organization. So making sure before anything ever happens that there is a plan in place. Part of this planning and this organizing is making sure that all the resources that will be necessary are available. In today's world, that might be N95 masks at a hospital. But the organizing part of this is making sure that you're responsible for the resources that are necessary. Commanding is being responsible for encouraging and giving directions to staff. So who is responsible for saying, this is what we're doing today? I don't necessarily love the word commanding, but I do know that this is an important part of management, is giving directions. If you're in a class with me, you often have check-ins. These check-ins are part of me both encouraging you, keeping you in task, asking if you have questions, giving you an opportunity to respond, after I've created the resources and attempted to organize the course in a way that makes sense for you. You may already be able to tell that I, as a teacher, follow more of Foyle's approach than a scientific management one. The next level here, the next function of management is coordinating. So being responsible for cooperation between units and parties. This is something that I do with both students and with faculty. In my administrative life, I work between advising and faculty on creating schedules for new semesters. And in the teaching part of my career, I work between students and other entities at the university when they're having trouble. But part of my personal management style of my classroom is that if I can link together the units and parties that are able to help one another, that is part of my responsibility as a leader. Not everybody takes on that management style, but it's one I'm comfortable with. Probably because I really do believe in the last function of management, which is controlling, that the person in charge needs to be responsible for both evaluation of the system and adjustment where appropriate. So that little line in the syllabus that says Dr. Dussault reserves the right to change the schedule as needed is not there because I might decide I want to go on vacation. Right? That's not why that's there. That line is there because if I think we're either further ahead than I thought we would be or further behind, I need to have the right to change how things are going, change modalities, change things as we go in order to have the best possible experience I have. And certainly there are people above me at the university who are making those same decisions about my life and my ability to manage. So inside of that hierarchical system, you need to know where you fit and what it is you actually control. That really leads nicely into bureaucracy. I've been using this image of these chairs that are seated, probably not quite 6 feet apart, but it seems to fit together now than when I originally picked the image. But bureaucracy was originally created to protect employees because it ensured certain things for employee rights. It gave employees a fixed division of labor and a hierarchy, meaning you know who you were responsible to report to, and you knew exactly what it is you were supposed to do. So you have your job description, and you know the flow chart of who you have to report to in order to be given credit for your work. This includes the rules to govern performance. So if you've started a new job, and you've been given this job description, it may say, these are the things you need to do, and these are the things you'll be evaluated on at the end of a year or whatever your evaluation period is. Bureaucracy also ensures or tries to protect a separation of work and personal life. Now, I find this interesting personally because we talk a lot in modern times about work-life balance, but bureaucracy also often tries to keep work and life separate, which aren't always the same thing. Being able to work and being able to live sometimes need to intertwine, and one needs to give to the other. Certainly during the pandemic, every parent who's tried to work from home and also homeschool their children have felt how hard it can be to separate work and personal life. Bureaucracy also works to protect equal treatment of all employees, which means if you are hired at a certain level, you are treated the same way as everybody else on that level, treats employment as career service or expects employment as career service, meaning you will work your way up through the ranks of that hierarchy, and that tenure protects against dismissal. Now, tenure has nothing to do with time. It has to do with respect and protections that are given to you because of rank. I've been at the University of Central Florida for 17 years. I don't have tenure. I'll never have tenure because I'm not on a tenure earning line. I don't want to be on a 10-year earning line because at an R1 institution, that means you teach less and research more. I can research, but it's because I want to, not because it's a requirement. I do teach more because that's what I want to do. This is why many institutions are moving away from tenure. It was intended to protect researchers that were doing dangerous or controversial or difficult research from being dismissed from their position because of their research, not to protect faculty that did not want to teach from having to follow the rules. So that is where that comes in. Now, there are many problems with bureaucracy, but among its most major limitations is that it does not deal well with non-routine tasks and does not like the impact or input of others outside of its system. And one of the ways to understand this and why it was important we talked about Prussia's army at the beginning is that this often evolved into military. And today we think of the military as a very bureaucratic system that has these items in place. Women in the military was an issue because women's menstruation cycle was seen as a non-routine task. Like, what are we supposed to do? Airlift tampons into Afghanistan? That was an actual question that I heard mentioned in a meeting talking about bureaucracy many, many, many years ago in the 90s when talking about women in the military and what that was going to look like. It makes me reflect on the fact that I was a high school senior in the Gulf War, the first strike in the Bush administration against Saddam Hussein. So really, my life has been largely defined by the impacts of bureaucracy and the ability to manage those. The reason I say that is this. Outside influence and opinion began to evolve during that Gulf War even more than during, say, the Vietnam War, because we could come home and watch on TV live footage of what was happening because of news reporting rather than waiting for news to come back to the United States. And certainly in previous wars of not knowing what was happening for a long period of time. So at the peak of scientific management, there's two major events. The first is the Great Depression, 1929 to 1940. This is, of course, after the Spanish flu and that pandemic. There's economic and social hardship for millions of people. This causes a major migration of workers. So the Midwest had a major migration to the West Coast because of droughts and social hardship with farming, and the rural South had a migration to northern cities to look for work in industrialized states. This led to a surplus of workers, and a surplus of workers often leads to an abuse of workers. And during the Great Depression was the birth of labor unions. Now, labor unions and their work is something we discuss more in social innovation and activism, but it's important for you to know that this is when labor unions began, and they began in order to advocate for human rights, fair wages, and improved working conditions. At the time of the Great Depression, if you could find work, the typical working day had become 12 hours with 1 half-hour break, 6 days a week, and there was no such thing as overtime. So there was not an hourly wage. Now, we now know that every state sets a minimum wage, and there is a federal minimum wage that is just over $7 an hour. There are some states in the South, such as Alabama, Mississippi, that actually still have state minimum wages lower than $7 an hour, but need to give at least the federal minimum wage. And that's why the current discussion about setting a higher federal minimum wage would force states to raise their own minimum wage, where many states are saying, no, we want to do this independently of the federal government. And unions often become involved. We know that this recently happened at Disney, where Disney's union created a different minimum wage than the state of Florida, which had an impact on the hospitality industry. Again, another discussion for another day. Towards the end of the Great Depression, part of what brought the United States out of the Great Depression was actually World War II. World War II started in 1935, lasted until 1945. This created an expansion of jobs. War is an industry that creates jobs in which people work. In addition to expanding jobs, war and crisis brought together academic researchers, organizational leaders, and military personnel into direct communication for one of the first times in order to engage in problem solving and the transformation of systems. Now, before we move on and talk about what that means, I have to stop and pause and say, if I didn't have the Great Depression and World War II on as headings, and I didn't say at the peak of scientific management, but changed that to at the beginning of 2020, major events occur, which include COVID-19 and the withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? So we could put something else here and look at many of these same things happening, or the flip of political parties or something else. Because when we said that theories are historical and metaphorical, we need to look at them in the time in which they began and look at them in the place in which we currently are. Specifically, this column that talks about the Great Depression, when you think about what the pandemic has done for millions of families, it has created economic and social hardship. It has forced a migration of people away from where they live in order to try to find work. And it has led to a surplus of workers, which has led to abuse of workers. And now there's all kinds of arguing about what improved working conditions look like. What does sanitation look like? What do HVAC systems look like? Is it safe to be in classrooms? We need to be wearing masks? There's all these things happening. And it is really very much the same. And at the same time, Wall Street is betting on things that might happen that will create an economic boom coming out of a depression or recession as we know it exists. So from this, W. Charles Redding, who was a pioneer of organizational communication, called that coming together of military, academia, and organizations the Triple Alliance. And this really is the building block for the science of organizational communication, which you are both studying in this class, and which is one of the two foundations of your major, which is organizational communication and interpersonal communication. When I started at the University of Central Florida in 2004, a student could be either an organizational communication major or an interpersonal communication major, depending on their desired focus. I don't remember exactly what year it was now, but we're just graduating some of the last members of when those two majors came together and students were organizational and interpersonal communication majors. And then a decision was made several years ago to change the label to human communication, which encompasses all types of communication, both organizationally, interpersonally, and a communication within the self and inside of social systems. And that is where the word human communication is born. And Kenneth Burke, an early communication theorist in the 1930s, was interested in the study of human communication as a way to resolve breakdowns in relationships. He famously said, "We are not being nice to one another, and communication is a roadmap to healing." And so this picture I have of this road here, even as I'm talking to you on this video today, reminds me that while sometimes we see the road ahead looks like an uphill climb, we know on the other side of that forward progress, can be something beautiful, can be something better. And as an organizational scientist, this is what I love about this work so much, is that it does repair and build stronger relationships in all areas. Now, this movement in OrgComm eventually led to a new approach in studying and applying human communication in the 20s through 40s. It was Mary Parker Follett, a Boston social worker, who had these radical ideas about leadership. She said, and I quote, "Cooperation among people working in groups under visionary leadership produces excellence." If I didn't tell you that this was Mary Parker Follett in the 30s, you might have thought that this was a statement that came from our current university president in an email yesterday. Because this idea, while radical at the time, was leading a charge to empower workers through a sharing of information and recognize that organizing teams is critical to accomplishing tasks. This is why you are so often put into groups in your classes. And I admit that often as faculty, we don't explain this correctly. There may be a variety of reasons why those groups exist. It may be that the class is too large to manage without them. It may be to create what I like to refer to groups as success pods, so that no one feels alone and people have a place to come back. But having done this for nearly 2 decades, there is never a time where I have groups in a class and someone doesn't say to me, "I hate groups," because I always do all the work and everybody else gets the credit. And to those people, I always try to impart, if you believe and you truly are the person that goes into a group in college and does the work, then the work you need to do is to practice being motivational and inspirational of your team, to bring them with you, to organize and communicate and give people the opportunity to opt in or opt out. And at the end of this story, it helps you develop the skills to become an actual leader in an actual organization where, guess what? Different people are going to put different amount of effort into the same tasks. And great leaders are both motivational and transformational. In this day and age, that does not sound radical. But when Mary Parker Follett was saying it, it was absolutely a radical idea. But professors like Elton Mayo at Harvard picked up on this and stressed the limits of individual rationality and the importance of interpersonal relationships, which began to create the other side of this science. And in studying interpersonal relationships, Mayo said that society is comprised of groups, and individuals are swayed by group norms, and individuals are swayed by emotions. So unless we handle interpersonal relationships and those interpersonal relationships inside groups, we are going to lose control of society. Again, these are things that if I took the headings off and you didn't know I was talking about the 20s through 40s, you might think I was talking about today. And that brings us to where we are. 2022, I don't know, the beginning of the pandemic to wherever we mark the end of what this is and what we redefine as the future will be without uncertainty, even though change is always a part of the process, as we talked about last week. So as we sit here today and we move forward into other lectures, I ask you to consider what has changed and what has stayed the same from what we just discussed in a historical framework to where we are now. This is why we need to understand where we've been in order to assess where we go next. And as we talked about last week, and as we'll continue to talk about in the weeks to come, students at universities today who will be in their 40s as the future bosses of the kids that are being born in 2020 and 2021, 2022, 2023 as pandemic babies during COVID. Those will be the students graduating from college that you will be trying to lead as you move forward. So how do you learn from history in order to engage in meaningful structural change moving forward? That's the end of the lesson for today. I look forward to seeing you in the discussions and applying this exciting knowledge to the work we're doing.